The room went silent the moment I walked in. My father chuckled under his breath, the way he always did when he thought he'd already won. My mother shook her head, slow and tired, like she'd run out of ways to be disappointed in me. I didn't say a word. I'd learned long ago that speaking only gave them something else to twist. 17 years of small humiliations had taught me how to stand still, how to take the hit without flinching. Every sigh, every rolled eye, every time they pretended not to hear me, that was its own kind of violence. But something in me shifted that morning in the Teton County courthouse. Maybe it was the way my father smirked, or how my mother couldn't even look at me. Maybe it was because I finally realized they'd never see me for who I was, only for who they decided I'd failed to be. Judge Thomas Sullivan's eyes went straight to the silver ring on my right hand, the same ring he wore on his, the same ring my grandfather earned pulling him from a collapsing bunker at Chosin Reservoir, 1950. They thought I came back broken. They had no idea what I'd built while they forgot I existed. So I straightened my back, took one steady breath, and let the silence burn hotter than their judgment. I'd kept my peace long enough, and they had no idea what that silence was about to cost them. 3 days earlier, the blade in my hand had caught a sliver of morning light as I ran the cloth down its edge. The motion was slow, deliberate, steady. It was the same blade I'd carried halfway across the world once, back when discipline meant survival. Now it was just habit, muscle memory from another lifetime, the kind of routine that kept the past from creeping too close. My office sat on the 24th floor of a steel and glass tower in downtown Seattle, the kind of building that looked like every other successful tech or consulting firm headquarters. The skyline stretched behind my desk, Puget Sound a silver thread in the distance. The brass nameplate on the door read, Morrison Security Consulting, Pentagon Certified Defense Contractor Advisory. Underneath, in smaller letters, Catherine A. Morrison, founder and CEO. Nobody in Wyoming knew this building existed. Nobody in my family knew I'd built anything beyond a modest military pension and whatever enlisted sailors managed to scrape together. I'd kept it that way on purpose. Silence wasn't absence. Silence was choice. Silence was strength dressed in business casual and backed by ironclad NDA. The phone on my desk buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number, Wyoming area code. My hand hesitated over the blade for half a second before I set it down and picked up the receiver. A woman's voice, clipped and professional, introduced herself as a clerk from the Teton County Court. She asked if I was Catherine Ann Morrison, formerly of Morrison Ridge Ranch. I confirmed. She told me I'd been served a summons and that official documents were being mailed to my address of record, but she wanted to ensure I received notice. The plaintiffs were listed as Robert James Morrison and Linda Marie Morrison, my parents. My pulse didn't quicken. It just stopped for a moment, the way it used to in those seconds before an IED detonated, when the world narrowed to a single point of focus and everything else became irrelevant noise. I thanked her for the call and hung up. The envelope arrived by courier an hour later. I tore it open, the paper trembling slightly against my fingers not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of what I was reading. Plaintiffs: Robert and Linda Morrison. Defendant: Catherine Ann Morrison. Case number 2024-CV-1847. Petition for property division and abandonment claim. Morrison Ridge Ranch, 1,200 acres in Teton County, Wyoming. Parcel ID TC-1847-002. Estimated value, $2.8 million. 17 years. 17 years of silence. And this was how they chose to reach me. Not a phone call, not a letter. A lawsuit. The smell of coffee filled the air as I sat at the kitchen table in my Seattle apartment that evening. My German shepherd, Duke, lifted his head just long enough to see I wasn't moving, then went back to sleep at my feet. I stared at the words on the legal documents, the language cold and transactional. They claimed I had abandoned the property, claimed I had shirked familial responsibility, claimed the ranch should be divided equally among surviving family members because the will had been executed under undue influence. Morrison Ridge Ranch. My grandfather's hands had built it plow by plow, fence by fence, starting in 1952 when he came back from Korea with shrapnel still lodged in his shoulder and nightmares he never talked about. He used to say honor isn't what you say, It's what you keep when nobody's watching. When he died in 2007, the will left it to me. Every acre. My father never argued, not out loud. He just threw the letter in the fire and walked away. Now here it was again, the past clawing back, wrapped in legal ink and stamped with the seal of Teton County. I stood, the ache in my left knee flaring like it always did when a storm was coming. The old injury from Kandahar, 2012, shrapnel from an IED that killed 2 of my team members and left me with a purple heart and a limp I'd learned to hide in polite company. I walked to the corner of my apartment where an old military footlocker waited, the kind issued to every service member who'd ever deployed. When I lifted the lid, the scent of salt and worn leather hit like memory made physical. The uniform was still there, navy dress blues, brass buttons dulled by time, but still regulation. I ran my thumb along the collar seam, remembering the day I'd been promoted to commander, the 05 rank I'd worn for the last 4 years of my career, before retiring in 2023. My phone buzzed again. This time I recognized the number. Margaret Chen, the woman everyone in our corner of Wyoming called Maggie. She'd been our neighbor for 40 years, my grandfather's closest friend after his wife Rose died in 1956. I answered. Her voice came through crackling and thin, the way older women's voices sometimes do when they're trying to stay composed. She'd heard about the lawsuit. Word traveled fast in small towns, and court filings were public record. She wanted me to know she had something for me, something my grandfather had left in her safekeeping before he died, something she'd promised not to give me unless certain conditions were met. A lawsuit from my own parents qualified as one of those conditions. I told her I'd be there in 2 days. That night, I opened the financial records I kept in a locked file cabinet, the kind of documentation most people never bother with, but that I'd maintained with military precision for 17 years. Every property tax payment on Morrison Ridge, stamped and signed. Every insurance premium. Every maintenance fund deposit. The total came to $187,450 in taxes alone, plus another $139,400 in insurance premiums. All of it paid from my Navy salary, then my pension, then the income from the business I'd built while serving. At the bottom of the file, folded between receipts, was one of my grandfather's old letters. The ink had faded to a pale blue, but I could still read his careful handwriting. If they ever come for the land, don't fight for me. Fight for what it meant. The paper trembled in my hand as the night wind slipped through the open window, brushing against my cheek like breath that hadn't aged at all. I called my executive assistant the next morning and told her I needed 2 weeks, possibly 3. She didn't ask questions. We'd been working together for 6 years, and she knew better than to pry when I used that tone. I forwarded her the contracts that needed signatures, authorized her to handle client communications in my absence, and sent an encrypted email to my board of directors informing them I'd be unreachable except for emergencies. Morrison Security Consulting had been my side project when I started it in 2012, something I did on weekends and evenings while still on active duty. By 2015, it was bringing in $800,000 a year. By 2020, after I'd earned Pentagon certification and started landing contracts with the major defense firms, revenue had jumped to $4.2 million annually. The business was now valued at $14.8 million, according to the assessment Ernst & Young had completed last quarter. Booz Allen Hamilton had made an acquisition offer 2 weeks ago, $18.5 million, all cash, with a retention package that would keep me on as a senior consultant for 3 years at $500,000 per year. Nobody in Wyoming knew any of this. I had no social media presence, no public interviews, no Forbes profile or industry awards displayed anywhere my family might stumble across them. My professional life existed in a completely separate universe from the people who shared my last name, and I'd constructed it that way with the same deliberate precision I'd once used to defuse improvised explosive devices in Ramadi. The flight from Seattle to Jackson Hole took 3 hours. I rented a truck at the airport, the same model I used to drive when I was 17 and learning how to work cattle with my grandfather. The highway stretched out toward the Tetons, those jagged peaks cutting into a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. This was the landscape that had raised me, taught me what endurance looked like when it was carved into geology. By the time I crossed into Teton County, the sign that read "Welcome to God's Country" looked less like a greeting and more like a warning. Some places don't forgive you for leaving, and they sure as hell don't forget. Morrison Ridge sat hollow in the valley, just as I'd imagined it would. The fence had caved in along the eastern pasture. Weeds grew shoulder-high where my grandfather used to plant winter wheat. I stepped out of the truck, boots sinking into the dirt he'd once turned with his bare hands, and for a moment, I was 12 years old again, following him along the creek at dawn while he explained how the land spoke if you knew how to listen. Inside the main house, the walls smelled of dust and abandonment. His portrait, the one that used to hang above the fireplace, was gone. In its place sat a pile of papers, bank records stamped with the logo of Teton Valley Bank, each one signed by my father. I flipped through them. The dates went back to 2017. The stated purpose on several: equine operations. Morrison Ridge had never seen a horse except for the ones we rode for work. My grandfather hated the idea of turning the ranch into some dude ranch tourist trap, the kind of place where city people came to play cowboy for a weekend. This wasn't equine operations. This was something else. I found more in his old office, the drawer still sticking halfway the same way it had when I was a kid trying to sneak candy from his desk. I pried it open and discovered a folded land map marked with a silver X over the northwest pasture. Beneath it, a tin box waited, the kind men of his generation used to store important things they didn't trust to safety deposit boxes. Inside lay the original will, sealed and notarized by Margaret Chen in her capacity as a notary public, dated August 15, 2007, 2 months before he died. The language was simple and clear. I, William James Morrison, being of sound mind, do hereby leave Morrison Ridge Ranch in its entirety, all 1,200 acres designated as Parcel TC-1847-002, to my granddaughter Catherine Ann Morrison, effective immediately upon my death. She understands this land better than anyone. She will keep it right. But there was something else in the box. A leather journal, the cover worn soft with age and handling. I opened it to a random page and saw my grandfather's handwriting, entries dated across decades. I flipped to the entries from 2007, the summer before he died. June 15, 2007. Robert came by tonight. He was drunk. Said I should leave the land to him, not Kat. Said the girl would abandon it the first chance she got. That military service was just her way of running from responsibility. I told him Kat understands responsibility better than he ever did. She understands sacrifice. She serves this country while he serves himself. He hit me. My own son, 66 years old, hit his 78-year-old father over dirt and grass and the idea of money. Maggie came running when she heard the shouting. Robert left. I told Maggie not to tell Kat. But I know I have to protect her now. I'm changing the will tomorrow morning. The lawyer is coming at 9. Kat will be protected. I sat down on the floor, the journal pages shaking in my hands. My father had struck him, had actually raised his hand to a 78-year-old man because of inheritance. And my grandfather had changed his will the next day to ensure I'd be taken care of, to ensure the land would go to someone who valued it for what it represented, rather than what it could be sold for. He died 2 months later. Heart attack, the doctor said, quick and painless. But I'd been in Afghanistan when it happened, leading a convoy through Kandahar province, and nobody had bothered to send word through proper channels. I'd found out 3 weeks after the burial via an email from Maggie that simply said, "Your grandfather passed. Thought you should know. Your father said you were too busy saving the world to care about family." I'd submitted emergency leave immediately. It was denied due to operational tempo. By the time I made it back to the States 6 months later, the headstone had already been placed, and my father had moved on to pretending none of it mattered. Except it did matter. It mattered that I'd been kept away. It mattered that I'd never gotten to say goodbye. And it mattered that the only thing tying me to the man who'd believed in me was 1,200 acres of Wyoming grassland that my father was now trying to take. The phone in my pocket buzzed. I pulled it out and saw a text from Maggie. "Come to the diner on Main Street, 6 p.m. I have what Bill left for you." I stood, my knee protesting, and walked out to the porch. The sun was dropping toward the Tetons, painting everything in shades of orange and gold that photographers paid thousands to capture. This was the view my grandfather had looked at every evening of his adult life. This was what he'd fought to preserve, not for profit, but for continuity, for the idea that some things should remain unchanged even when the world around them went to hell. I drove into town as twilight settled over the valley. Main Street looked exactly as it had when I left. The same storefronts, the same faded paint, the same sense that time moved differently here than it did in the rest of the world. Linda's Pie Corner sat at the corner of Main and Birch, the sign bleached by decades of sun. Through the fogged window, I could see my mother wiping down the counter, her movements practiced and automatic. When her eyes met mine through the glass, she froze. The cloth fell from her hand. She turned away before I could lift mine in greeting, a gesture so quick and final it might as well have been a door slamming. Maggie was waiting in a booth at the back, her gray hair pulled into the same bun she'd worn for as long as I could remember. She didn't smile when I slid in across from her, just nodded once in that economical way people do, when they know a wound is still open and raw. She handed me a yellowed envelope without preamble. Inside was a single sheet of paper with my grandfather's handwriting, the letters shaky in a way his earlier journal entries hadn't been, as if he'd written this near the end when his hands weren't as steady. Kat, if they forget what Morrison stands for, remind them. Don't let pride burn this family to ash. I turned the envelope over and felt something else pressed inside. A photograph, old and faded, the colors gone sepia with age. My grandfather stood beside a young Marine in dress uniform, both of them grinning despite the obvious exhaustion in their faces. They both wore identical silver rings on their right hands, simple bands with an engraving I couldn't quite make out in the photo. On the back, in smeared ink, "To Tom Sullivan, from a brother in arms. Chosin Reservoir, 1950. The name meant nothing to me then, but Maggie's next words changed that. You know who Thomas Sullivan is. Teton County Circuit Court Judge. He's the one who'll be hearing your case. I set the photograph on the table, lamplight catching the faint outline of those matching rings. My grandfather and the judge who would decide the fate of Morrison Ridge had served together, had saved each other's lives, if the stories about Chosen were even half true. Looks like the wind's still talking, I said. Maggie's eyes were sharp despite her age. Bill always said you had his gift for listening. The question is whether you'll hear what it's saying in time. I spent that night in a motel on the edge of town, the kind of place with thin walls and thinner mattresses where truckers stopped for a few hours between hauls. I spread every document I'd brought across the bed: tax records, insurance statements, the original will, the journal entry about my father's violence, the photograph of my grandfather and Judge Sullivan. Then I pulled out my laptop and started digging into public records, the kind of information anyone with basic internet access could find if they knew where to look. Property records for Morrison Ridge, mortgage filings, lien searches. That's when I found it. A mortgage filed March 17th, 2022. $870,000 borrowed against Morrison Ridge Ranch. The lender, Teton Valley Bank. The borrower, Catherine Ann Morrison. The co-signer, listed as attorney-in-fact, Daniel Robert Morrison, attorney at law. My signature was right there on the scanned documents, clear as day. Except I'd never signed anything. I'd been in the Mediterranean in March 2022, commanding operations aboard the USS Carney. My service record could prove it. My passport could prove it. There was no physical way I could have been in Wyoming to sign mortgage documents. Daniel had forged my signature. My own brother had committed fraud, stolen my identity, and used it to borrow nearly $1 million against property that wasn't his to leverage. I kept digging. Credit reports, loan applications, every database I had legal access to through my security clearances and professional networks. The picture grew uglier with each search. 3 credit cards opened in my name, March through June 2022. Total debt, $47,000. 2 personal loans from predatory lenders, totaling another $290,000. All of it secured against my supposedly stellar credit rating. All of it carrying my forged signature. Total attempted theft, $1.2 million. I called Teton Valley Bank the next morning, using a voice changer app I'd picked up during my EOD days when we needed to make calls without revealing our identities. Claimed to be Catherine Morrison calling to check on my mortgage account. The bank officer was helpful, efficient, professional. She confirmed the loan balance, $743,000 remaining. Monthly payment, $6,200. Current status, 90 days past due. Foreclosure notice issued August 15th, 2024. Daniel had stopped making payments. The bank was preparing to seize Morrison Ridge, and my parents were suing me to force a sale before that could happen, trying to extract whatever equity remained before it all disappeared into a foreclosure auction. They weren't fighting for the land. They were fighting to salvage cash from the wreckage of my brother's fraud. I met Daniel at the diner that afternoon. Maggie had called ahead, told him his sister wanted to talk. He showed up looking like a man who'd aged a decade in the 2 years since I'd last seen a photo of him on social media, back when I still checked such things. His suit was rumpled, tie crooked, the kind of dishevelment that spoke to deeper problems than just a bad morning. He slid into the booth across from me, couldn't quite meet my eyes, said it was good to see me, asked how I'd been, all the small talk people make when they're stalling before the real conversation. I didn't bother with pleasantries. Pulled out the mortgage documents and laid them on the table between us. Asked him point blank if he wanted to explain how my signature ended up on loan papers when I was 3,000 miles away on a Navy destroyer. His face went pale. The color just drained out like someone had pulled a plug. He started to say something, stopped, tried again, finally managed, "You found it." I waited. Let the silence do the work it was meant to do. He told me about Dad's gambling debts, $340,000 lost over 2 years at casinos in Las Vegas, high-stakes poker games where he'd been taking markers he couldn't cover. The casino had sent collectors, real ones, the kind affiliated with organizations that didn't go through legal channels. They'd shown up at the ranch, shown up at Mom's bakery, made it clear what would happen if the debt wasn't paid. Daniel had panicked, saw the ranch as the only asset valuable enough to cover the debt, convinced himself he could take out a mortgage, pay off the dangerous men, then flip a big real estate deal he had pending and pay back the mortgage before anyone noticed. The deal was supposed to close in 6 months, $200,000 in commission, enough to make everything right. Except the deal fell through. The buyers got cold feet. Daniel lost the commission and couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments. The debt to the casino was paid, but now the bank was circling, and there was no way out except to force a sale of the property and split whatever equity remained. "How much does Mom know?" I asked. Everything," he said. "She's known from the beginning. She was there when the casino collectors came. She begged me to find another way, but she wouldn't go to the police. Said it would destroy Dad, destroy our family name. So she stayed quiet and let me handle it. And now she's suing me alongside him." Daniel looked down at his hands. Said Mom thought it was the only way to save Dad's life. That if the debt wasn't paid, the people he owed would eventually come back for what they were owed, one way or another. I stood up without another word, left him sitting there with the mortgage documents and the weight of what he'd done. Drove back out to Morrison Ridge as afternoon turned to evening, the Tetons going purple in the fading light. The ranch sat empty and waiting. I walked through rooms that still smelled like my grandfather's pipe tobacco, even though he'd been dead for 17 years. Found the old supply chest in the corner of his bedroom, the one he'd brought back from Korea. When I opened it, the scent of gun oil and canvas hit me like a physical thing. The uniform was folded at the bottom, navy dress blues, the ones I'd worn to his funeral, the ones I'd carefully preserved because they represented everything he'd taught me about service and sacrifice, and doing the right thing even when nobody was watching. I lifted them out, felt the weight of the wool, the brass buttons still catching light despite years in darkness, held them up and realized they'd fit the same way they had the last time I wore them, back when I was still on active duty, and my grandfather was still a voice in my head reminding me that honor wasn't inherited, it was earned. Tomorrow I'd walk into that courthouse. I'd stand before Judge Sullivan, the man my grandfather had saved in Korea. I'd present my evidence methodically and completely, the way I'd been trained to do during mission briefings and after-action reports. But I wouldn't reveal everything at once, wouldn't show them the full picture of what I'd built during the 17 years they'd pretended I didn't exist. Let them think I was a struggling veteran fighting for the only asset I had. Let them underestimate me completely. The best victories come when your opponent doesn't see the trap until it closes. I tried on the uniform that evening, standing in front of the mirror in my grandfather's bedroom. It fit perfectly. The ribbons on the chest told their own story. Bronze star with combat V purple heart. Navy Commendation Medal, Expert Marksman, Overseas Service Ribbons from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and at the top, the small gold insignia of a commander, O5, the rank I'd earned through 2 decades of service while my family convinced themselves I was wasting my life. I took the silver ring from my pocket, the one I'd never worn. My grandfather had given it to me in a box he'd mailed to my first duty station, along with a note that said, "You earned this the day you decided to serve something bigger than yourself." The ring bore the same inscription as the one in the photograph with Judge Sullivan. Honor endures. I slipped it onto my right hand. It fit like it had been made for me, because in a way, it had. My grandfather had worn this ring through Korea, through decades of ranching and raising a family and teaching a granddaughter what mattered in life. Now it would go into a courtroom and remind a judge who'd once fought alongside Bill Morrison exactly what was at stake. I packed the rest of my evidence into a leather briefcase. The tax records, the insurance statements, the original will notarized by Maggie, the journal entry about my father's violence. Then I added the items they wouldn't expect. My military service record showing my location in March 2022, when the fraudulent mortgage was filed. Passport stamps and ship's logs from the USS Carney. Geographic coordinates placing me in the Mediterranean Sea at the exact time my signature allegedly appeared on loan documents in Wyoming. And finally, the pieces they'd never imagined existed. My business tax returns showing Morrison Security Consulting's revenue over the past 12 years, the valuation report from Ernst & Young, real estate holdings in 4 states with a combined worth of over $2 million, the acquisition offer from Booz Allen Hamilton with its $18.5 million price tag. But those would wait. Those would come out only when the moment was right, when they'd committed themselves so fully to the narrative of my failure that the truth would hit like an IED they never saw coming. I slept that night in my grandfather's bed, Duke curled up on the floor beside me. The house creaked and settled around us, old wood adjusting to temperature changes, the sounds of a structure that had weathered 70 years of Wyoming winters and wouldn't surrender to time without a fight. In the morning, I'd put on the uniform. I'd drive to the courthouse. I'd walk past my mother's bakery and my father's smirk and my brother's shame. I'd stand before a judge who owed his life to the man who taught me everything I knew about honor and duty and fighting for things that mattered. They thought silence meant I'd given up. They thought absence meant I'd forgotten. They had no idea that while they'd been gambling and forging and lying, I'd been building an empire they couldn't see and wouldn't understand until it was too late. You can steal my inheritance, I thought, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. You can forge my signature. You can take the land my grandfather left me, but you can't steal what I built with my own hands, my own mind, and my own honor. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, whispering through the gaps in the old ranch house the same way it had when I was young, and my grandfather would sit on the porch explaining how to read weather patterns in the movement of grass. He'd said the wind here tells the truth. When it goes quiet, Cat, that means you stop listening to it and to yourself. Tonight the wind was loud and clear. Tomorrow it would speak in a courtroom, through evidence and documentation, and the slow, methodical dismantling of lies that had held together for 17 years. I closed my eyes and let sleep come, knowing that morning would bring the beginning of something my family hadn't anticipated. Not revenge, not bitterness, just the simple, devastating weight of truth delivered by someone who'd learned long ago that the most powerful weapon wasn't anger. It was competence backed by evidence they couldn't deny. Morning came with frost on the windows, the kind of cold that settled into bones and reminded you winter in Wyoming didn't ask permission. I dressed in the bathroom of my grandfather's house, the mirror fogged from the shower, steam clinging to surfaces that hadn't seen warmth in months. The uniform went on piece by piece, each button a commitment, each crease a declaration. The woman looking back at me was 45 years old, Navy commander retired, CEO of a multi-million-dollar firm nobody here knew existed. The ribbons on my chest carried their own testimony: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, campaign medals from 3 war zones. My hair was pulled back regulation tight, silver threading through the brown at my temples in ways that would have horrified my mother when I was 20, but now just looked like survival. Duke watched from the doorway, his tail thumping once against the floor in approval, or maybe just recognition that we were going somewhere important. I fed him, checked that he had water, and locked the door behind me. The truck's engine turned over rough in the cold, protesting before settling into a steady idle. The drive into town took 20 minutes. Main Street was already awake, trucks parked outside the hardware store, lights on in Linda's Pie Corner where early risers gathered for coffee and gossip. I drove past without slowing, though I caught a glimpse of my mother through the window, her apron tied around her waist, her movements efficient and practiced. She didn't look up. The courthouse sat at the end of Center Street, a 3-story brick building that had been there since 1947, built with money from ranchers who'd done well after the war, and wanted their county seat to look respectable. The parking lot was half full already. I recognized several vehicles, Daniel's BMW among them, my father's pickup truck taking up 2 spaces the way it always did. I parked in the far corner and sat for a moment with the engine off, the cab growing cold around me. The briefcase on the passenger seat held everything, the evidence of their betrayal and the proof of my success, documents that would shift the entire narrative once they understood what they were looking at. But timing mattered. Deploy too early and the impact diminished. Deploy too late and credibility suffered. The steps up to the main entrance were granite, worn smooth by 70 years of boots and dress shoes and the weight of people seeking justice or avoiding it. Inside, the smell hit immediately. Floor wax and old paper, leather-bound law books, and decades of cigarette smoke that had soaked into wood paneling before anyone cared about secondhand exposure. The courtroom was on the 2nd floor. I took the stairs, my knee protesting but holding, the pain a familiar companion I'd learned to work around. The hallway outside Courtroom B was lined with benches where witnesses and families waited. A few people I didn't recognize sat scattered along the walls. One woman looked up as I approached, her eyes widening slightly at the uniform, at the insignia that marked me as someone who'd earned rank rather than been given it. The courtroom doors were oak, heavy, the kind that closed with authority. I pushed through and stepped into a space that smelled like furniture polish and tension. The gallery was filling up. Word had spread that Robert Morrison was suing his daughter. And in a town this size, family drama drew spectators the way accidents drew rubberneckers. My father sat at the plaintiff's table on the left, wearing a suit I recognized from weddings and funerals, the fabric shiny at the elbows from age. My mother sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Daniel occupied the chair closest to the bar, a legal pad open before him, pen poised like he was ready to take notes on his own destruction. They all looked up when I entered. The room didn't go silent, not exactly, but the quality of sound changed, conversations dropping to whispers, heads turning to track my progress down the center aisle. My father's expression shifted from confidence to something harder to read, surprise maybe, or calculation. My mother's face drained of color, her hands tightening in her lap until the knuckles showed white. Judge Sullivan wasn't on the bench yet. I took my seat at the defendant's table on the right, alone, set my briefcase down, removed my cover and placed it precisely at the corner of the table, the gold officer's insignia catching overhead lights. The silver ring on my right hand matched the one Judge Sullivan would be wearing, and when he saw it, when he made the connection, everything would shift. The bailiff entered from a side door, a man in his 50s whose name I'd forgotten, but whose face I remembered from high school football games. He didn't recognize me, not at first. Not until he checked his roster and saw my name listed as defendant. His eyebrows lifted fractionally, but he said nothing, just moved to his position near the bench. The clerk followed, a younger woman who arranged papers with practiced efficiency. Then the side door opened again, and Judge Thomas Sullivan stepped into the courtroom. He was 72, but carried himself like a man 20 years younger, spine straight, shoulders squared, marine posture, the kind that never fully leaves even decades after discharge. His hair had gone completely white, but remained thick, cut short in a style that suggested he still thought of himself as a service member first and civilian second. The black robe made him look taller, more imposing, but it was his eyes that held attention, sharp, assessing, missing nothing. He took his seat behind the bench, adjusted his glasses, and began scanning the documents in front of him. His gaze moved from the papers to the courtroom, taking in the players, the spectators, the weight of what was about to unfold. Then his eyes landed on me, moved to the uniform, to the ribbons, to the ring on my right hand. He stopped, just for a second, a hitch in his movement that anyone not watching closely would have missed. But I was watching, and I saw the recognition flash across his face, saw him glance down at his own right hand, where an identical silver band caught the light. The bailiff called the court to order. Everyone stood. Sullivan took another moment, his eyes still on that ring, before speaking. Case number 2, 024-CV-1847, Morrison versus Morrison. The plaintiff is represented by counsel Daniel Morrison. The defendant, Catherine Morrison, is appearing pro se. I stood, confirmed my presence, sat back down. Sullivan's voice was controlled, professional, but I caught the undercurrent, the tension of a man confronting something unexpected. Before we begin, I need to establish for the record, Ms. Morrison, you are the granddaughter of William Morrison. Yes, Your Honor. The courtroom was silent now, every ear tuned to this exchange. And that ring you're wearing, where did you get it? My grandfather gave it to me, Your Honor. He wore it through Korea. He said I earned it the day I decided to serve something bigger than myself. Sullivan's jaw tightened. He looked down at the matching ring on his own hand, and I saw the memory move through him. Saw him transported back to 1950, to a frozen reservoir in collapsing positions, to my grandfather pulling him from a bunker while enemy fire cut through the night around them. Your grandfather was the finest man I ever served with. He saved my life at Chosin Reservoir. My father shifted in his chair, confusion crossing his face. You knew her grandfather? We were brothers in arms, Mr. Morrison, which means this court will be held to the highest standards of impartiality and evidence. Nothing about our shared history will influence my judgment, but everything about your father's character will inform my expectations. Am I clear? Yes, Your Honor. Good. Mr. Morrison, you're representing the plaintiffs. Present your opening statement. Daniel stood, and for a moment I saw the boy he'd been, the younger brother who'd followed me around the ranch asking questions, who'd cried when I left for boot camp. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who'd committed fraud to cover his father's gambling debts, and was now trying to steal my inheritance to salvage the wreckage. Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of abandonment and undue influence. My clients, Robert and Linda Morrison, have maintained Morrison Ridge Ranch for 17 years, while the defendant pursued a military career overseas. Ms. Morrison has never visited the property, never contributed to its upkeep, never demonstrated any interest in the family legacy. The will leaving the ranch solely to her was executed when our grandfather was 78 years old and in declining health, clearly the result of manipulation by a young woman who exploited an elderly man's affection. I kept my face neutral, let him build his case. We're asking the court to invalidate the will on grounds of undue influence and to order the property divided equally among surviving family members, as would be appropriate under normal intestate succession. He sat down. Sullivan looked at me. Ms. Morrison, your opening statement. I stood, no notes, no hesitation. Your Honor, I'll present evidence that I've paid $187,450 in property taxes over 17 years, plus $139,400 in insurance premiums. I'll show that my brother forged my signature on a mortgage for $870,000, along with credit cards and personal loans totaling an additional $337,000. I'll demonstrate that my father incurred gambling debts of $340,000, and that this lawsuit is not about abandonment, but about covering theft and fraud before a bank forecloses on property they've already stolen. And I'll prove that my grandfather changed his will 2 months before his death, specifically to protect me from the son who struck him during an argument about this very inheritance. The courtroom erupted. Whispers became voices. Voices became shouts. Sullivan's gavel came down hard. Order! We will have order, or I'll clear this courtroom. Silence returned, fragile and tense. Those are serious allegations, Ms. Morrison. You have evidence? Extensive documentation, Your Honor. Then let's see it. Mr. Morrison, call your first witness. The next hour unfolded like watching a slow-motion collision. Daniel called my father to the stand, established the basic facts. The ranch had been in the family since 1952. My grandfather had died in 2007. The will had left everything to me. Robert's testimony painted me as an absent daughter who'd chosen military service over family, who'd never shown interest in ranching. who'd convinced her grandfather to disinherit his own son. When Daniel finished, Sullivan looked at me. Cross-examination, Ms. Morrison? I approached the witness stand carrying a single folder. Mr. Morrison, when did you last visit Morrison Ridge before filing this lawsuit? My father blinked. Last year, maybe. I don't recall exactly. The property records show you haven't paid taxes on the ranch since 2007. Is that correct? The ranch wasn't mine to pay taxes on. It was yours, according to that will. But you've been living there, haven't you? Using the land? We've maintained it. Someone had to. I opened the folder, removed the bank statements I'd found in my grandfather's office. These show withdrawals from Morrison Ridge operating accounts from 2017 to present, all signed by you. Purpose listed, equine operations. Did the ranch run horses during that time? His face reddened. We considered it. These total $310,000 over 7 years. Where did that money go? Operating expenses. The ranch had no horses, no cattle after 2015. What operations required $310,000? Sullivan interrupted. Mr. Morrison answered the question. My father's hands gripped the witness box rail. Various expenses, maintenance, repairs. I pulled out the next document. This is a statement from Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas showing marker debt in your name totaling $220,000, dated between 2018 and 2023. Is this your signature? He didn't answer. Mr. Morrison? I may have borrowed some money from a casino, using credit extended for gambling. It was personal business. Personal business funded by money taken from ranch accounts you didn't own. I showed him another page, and this is a police report filed by Teton County Sheriff's Department in April 2022, documenting a complaint by Mrs. Margaret Chen about suspicious men asking questions about your whereabouts. The investigating officer's notes indicate these men were described as enforcers and were traced to a Las Vegas organized crime family. Were you aware of this report? Daniel was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. Sullivan leaned forward. I'll allow it. Mr. Morrison, answer. My father's voice came out tight. I had some debts. I took care of them. How did you take care of them? Silence. Did you take care of them by having your son forge my signature on mortgage documents to borrow $870,000 against property that belonged to me? Objection. Overruled. Mr. Morrison, did you know your son obtained a fraudulent mortgage using your daughter's identity? Robert looked at Daniel, then back at me, then down at his hands. I knew he was trying to help, to save the family, to save you from debts you incurred through illegal gambling. Sullivan's gavel came down. That's enough, Ms. Morrison. Step back. Mr. Morrison, you're excused. I returned to my table, pulled out the next folder. Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence of the fraudulent mortgage and related identity theft. Approach. I brought the documents to the bench. Mortgage papers with my forged signature. Credit card applications I'd never authorized. Personal loan agreements bearing a signature that looked like mine but wasn't. The difference is subtle but present to anyone trained in document analysis. And underneath all of that, my military service record showing I'd been aboard the USS Carney in the Mediterranean Sea on March 17, 2022. The exact date my signature allegedly appeared on loan documents in Teton County, Wyoming. Sullivan examined each page, his expression darkening. Ms. Morrison, you were deployed when this mortgage was filed? Yes, Your Honor. Ship's logs, passport stamps, and GPS coordinates all confirm my location. There's no physical way I could have signed these documents. And you're alleging your brother forged your signature? I'm not alleging. I'm stating fact, supported by evidence. Daniel Morrison is listed as attorney-in-fact on these documents, claiming power of attorney I never granted. He used that fraudulent authority to steal my identity and borrow over $1 million against my property. Sullivan looked past me to where Daniel sat, his face the color of ash. Mr. Morrison, you'll need to address these allegations. Daniel stood on shaking legs. Your Honor, I can explain. Did you forge your sister's signature on these documents? The courtroom held its breath. Yes. The word fell like a stone into still water, ripples spreading outward in waves of shock and whispered commentary. Sullivan's gavel restored quiet, but couldn't erase what had been admitted. Why? Daniel's voice cracked. Our father owed money to dangerous people. Real threats, not collection agencies. They came to the ranch. They threatened our mother. I needed cash fast, and the ranch was the only asset valuable enough. I thought I could pay it back before anyone noticed. Thought I had a real estate deal closing that would cover everything. But it fell through and I couldn't make the payments, and then the bank started foreclosure proceedings, and we had to do something before we lost everything. So you sued your sister to force a sale before the bank could seize the property. We were trying to salvage what we could, to keep something for the family. By stealing from the family member who'd actually been maintaining the property for 17 years, I didn't know she was paying taxes. Dad said she'd abandoned us, that she didn't care about the ranch or the family or anything except her military career. Did you believe that? I was still standing at the bench, close enough to see Sullivan's knuckles whiten on his gavel. Did you really believe I'd abandoned property my grandfather specifically entrusted to me? Daniel looked at me finally, really looked at me, and something broke in his expression. No, I knew you'd kept faith with Grandpa Bill. I just didn't care. I was desperate and Dad needed help, and I told myself the end justified the means. Sullivan addressed me directly. Ms. Morrison, what else do you have? This was it. The moment everything shifted. I returned to my table, opened my briefcase, and began removing documents in careful sequence. Your Honor, I'd like to establish for the record my actual financial situation, which appears to be considerably different from what the plaintiffs assumed. I approached the bench again, this time with a stack of papers that represented 17 years of work, sacrifice, and strategic planning. Exhibit A, my complete tax return, 2007 through 2024. These show total income of $3.8 million over that period, all from legitimate military salary, pension, and business revenue. Sullivan accepted them, began scanning. Exhibit B, property tax receipts for Morrison Ridge Ranch, totaling $187,450, all paid on time, all paid from my Navy Federal Credit Union account. I laid those down. Exhibit C, insurance premium payments, $139,400, also paid consistently from my accounts. Another stack. Exhibit D, real estate holdings acquired during my service. A duplex in Virginia Beach valued at $680,000. A condo in San Diego valued at $520,000. A commercial property in Tacoma leased to a defense contractor, valued at $890,000. Combined portfolio value, $2.09 million. The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. My father's face had drained of all color. My mother's hands were pressed to her mouth. And finally, Your Honor, Exhibit E, Morrison Security Consulting, LLC, the business I founded in 2012 while still on active duty. This is the valuation report from Ernst & Young completed last quarter. Current assessed value, $14.8 million. I set it down carefully, watching Sullivan's eyes widen as he read the first page. The company advises Pentagon-certified defense contractors on military procurement and operational needs. Our client list includes Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and General Dynamics. Annual revenue exceeds $4.2 million. Behind me, someone in the gallery gasped. I didn't turn around. And this, Your Honor, is an acquisition offer received 2 weeks ago from Booz Allen Hamilton. They're offering $18.5 million, all cash, for 100% ownership of Morrison Security Consulting. Sullivan looked from the document to me, and I saw the moment he understood the full scope of what I'd built. Ms. Morrison, you're telling this court you own a company worth nearly $15 million, have real estate holdings worth over $2 million, and have received an acquisition offer for $18.5 million? Yes, Your Honor. And your family didn't know any of this? I have no social media presence, no public profile. My professional life has been deliberately separate from my personal history. They assumed I was a struggling enlisted veteran living on a modest pension. I let them believe that. Why? Because silence isn't absence, Your Honor. Silence is choice. I chose when to speak. Today is that day. I turned to face my father directly. The words came out calm, measured, each one landing with the precision of ordnance on target. You can steal my inheritance. You can forge my signature. You can take the land my grandfather left me. But you can't steal what I built with my own hands, my own mind, and my own honor. My father tried to stand, his voice breaking. That's impossible. You're just a what, Dad? Just the daughter you said would fail? Just the girl you told would be crushed by stronger men? Sullivan's gavel came down, but I continued, my voice never rising but carrying to every corner of the courtroom. While you gambled away $340,000, I built an empire. While you lied and forged and stole, I earned every dollar legally. You thought silence meant weakness. I chose when to speak. Today was that day. The impact of those words settled over the courtroom like fallout, invisible but transformative. My father collapsed back into his chair. My mother was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Daniel sat with his head in his hands. Sullivan cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the stillness. Mr. Morrison, let me understand this correctly. Your daughter, whom you sued for abandonment and failure to maintain family property, has paid nearly $330,000 in taxes and insurance over 17 years, built a real estate portfolio worth over $2 million, founded and grew a business now valued at nearly $15 million, maintained exemplary military service for 2 decades, and earned a Purple Heart and Bronze Star defending this country. Meanwhile, you gambled away hundreds of thousands, enabled your son to commit fraud totaling over $1 million, and are now attempting to force the sale of property you never maintained and don't legally own. Is my understanding correct? Silence. Mr. Morrison? My father's voice came out barely above a whisper. Yes, Your Honor. Sullivan looked at my mother. Mrs. Morrison, did you know about the gambling, the fraud, the forgery? Linda stood slowly, her legs unsteady. Yes, Your Honor. I knew everything. And you said nothing? Daniel told me that if I went to the police, if I tried to stop him, Her voice caught. He'd kill himself. He said he couldn't live with the shame of prison, that he'd rather die. So I stayed quiet. I chose my son's life over my daughter's rights. The honesty of it was brutal, unvarnished. Sullivan sat back in his chair. This court will recess for 1 hour to review all submitted evidence. When we reconvene, I'll make my ruling on the property claim and determine what criminal referrals, if any, need to be made regarding the fraud allegations. We are adjourned. The gavel came down with finality. I gathered my documents, replaced them in the briefcase with the same care I'd used to remove them. People were filing out of the courtroom, voices rising in speculation and shock. I felt Daniel approach before I saw him, sensed him standing beside my table. Kat, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I'm sorry. I looked at him. You're not sorry you did it. You're sorry you got caught. That's not true. You had a choice, Daniel. Every step of the way you had a choice. You chose to forge my signature. You chose to steal my identity. You chose to let Mom cover for you while you committed federal crimes. Don't stand there and tell me you're sorry when what you really mean is you're sorry it didn't work. I walked past him, through the gallery, out into the hallway. My mother was waiting there, pressed against the wall like she wanted to disappear into it. Kat, please, can we talk? There's nothing to say, Mom. Your father is sick. Gambling addiction is a real disease. Then he should have gotten help. You should have insisted on it. Instead, you enabled him for years and let Daniel commit crimes to cover the consequences. She reached for my arm. I stepped back. Don't. You chose them over me. You chose to protect the people who were destroying this family over the daughter who'd done nothing but honor the responsibilities she'd been given. That's your choice to live with, not mine to forgive. I walked away, down the stairs, out into November air that tasted like snow coming. The sky had gone gray, clouds building over the Tetons in formations that promised weather. My truck sat alone in the far corner of the lot, exactly where I'd left it. I sat in the cab and let myself feel it finally. The weight of 17 years of separation, the cost of building something in silence, the price of being right in a family that needed me to be wrong. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the steering wheel until they steadied. An hour later, I returned to the courtroom. The gallery was packed now, word having spread through town that something extraordinary was unfolding in the Morrison case. I took my seat. My family took theirs. We didn't look at each other. Sullivan entered, his expression grave. The bailiff called us to order. Having reviewed all evidence submitted, I'm prepared to rule. The will executed by William Morrison on August 15, 2007, is valid and enforceable. Morrison Ridge Ranch, in its entirety, belongs to Catherine Morrison as specified in that document. The claims of abandonment are not supported by evidence. Indeed, the evidence shows Ms. Morrison maintained consistent financial responsibility for the property over 17 years, while pursuing a distinguished military career. The plaintiff's case is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I'm referring the mortgage fraud and identity theft allegations to the Teton County District Attorney for criminal investigation. Mr. Daniel Morrison, you should secure legal counsel immediately. Regarding the gambling debts and misappropriated ranch funds, I'm ordering a full audit of all Morrison Ridge financial accounts from 2007 to present. Any discrepancies will be addressed through appropriate channels. He paused, looking directly at my father. Mr. Morrison, your daughter has shown more honor, discipline, and integrity than you or your son have demonstrated in this entire proceeding. You struck your own father over inheritance. You enabled criminal fraud. You gambled away a fortune and then attempted to steal from the child who'd remained faithful to family responsibility. You should be ashamed. My father's shoulders shook. Tears ran down his face, unchecked. Sullivan's tone softened fractionally. But shame can be the beginning of change, if you let it. I suggest you use whatever time you have left to become worthy of the family name your daughter has honored, despite your best efforts to destroy it. He looked at me. Commander Morrison, thank you for your service to this nation and to the memory of Bill Morrison. Your grandfather would be proud. The words hit harder than I'd expected. I managed a nod. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell for the final time. I stood and walked out while the courtroom was still processing what had happened. Down the stairs, through the main doors, into air that had grown colder, sharper. The first snowflakes were falling, sparse but deliberate, catching on my uniform and melting against the wool. My father caught up to me on the courthouse steps, moving faster than I'd have thought possible for a 66-year-old man carrying the weight of his failures. Cat, wait, please. I stopped, turned, looked at him. You won, you can be proud now. The words came out before I could stop them, unplanned but true. I never needed your approval, Dad. I needed your respect. There's a difference. One is a gift, the other is earned. You taught me to earn everything. I did. You just never looked. His face crumpled. I thought you were nothing. I thought you needed us. I know what you thought. I built an empire while you convinced yourself I was failing. That says everything about you and nothing about me. Can you forgive me? I don't know, not today, maybe not ever. But I can give you something you never gave me. Honesty. You're an addict and a liar and an enabler of criminals. You struck your father and disrespected his wishes and tried to steal from your daughter to cover your son's fraud. If you want forgiveness, start by becoming someone worth forgiving. I walked to my truck, got in, drove away while he stood there in falling snow. In my rearview mirror, I saw him collapse onto the steps, head in his hands, my mother rushing to him from the courthouse entrance. The ranch was quiet when I arrived, just the wind and Duke's greeting. I changed out of the uniform, hung it carefully in my grandfather's closet, put on jeans and a flannel shirt, the kind of clothes I'd worn as a teenager learning to mend fences and read weather and cloud formations. That evening, I sat on the porch watching twilight turn the Tetons purple and gold. My phone buzzed with messages I didn't read, calls I didn't answer. Tomorrow would bring decisions about what to do with the ranch, with the acquisition offer, with the family members who'd tried to destroy what my grandfather had built. But tonight I just sat in the cold, feeling the weight lift off shoulders that had carried it for 17 years. Silence had been my weapon and my shield. Truth had been my ammunition. And competence backed by evidence they couldn't deny had been the strategy that won a war I'd never wanted to fight. The wind picked up, speaking in the language my grandfather had taught me to understand. It said the storm was coming. It said change was inevitable. It said I'd fought well and won cleanly, and that sometimes victory tastes like vindication but feels like grief. I stayed there until full dark, until stars emerged above the Tetons, sharp and cold and absolutely clear. The week after the trial, Morrison Ridge sat under 6 inches of fresh snow, the kind that muffled sound and made the world feel smaller, more manageable. I spent those days walking the property with Duke, relearning boundaries I'd once known by heart. The fence lines needed work. The barn roof sagged in the middle where timbers had rotted through. The irrigation system my grandfather had installed in the 70s was a patchwork of rust and hope. I hired contractors from Jackson, men who understood ranching and didn't ask questions about lawsuits or family drama. Within 2 weeks, they'd shored up the barn, replaced fence posts, and begun the slow work of restoration. I paid them from Morrison Security Consulting accounts, watching my grandfather's legacy come back to life one repair at a time. Maggie stopped by on a Tuesday afternoon, her truck rattling up the drive with a box of my mother's pies in the passenger seat. She set them on the kitchen counter without ceremony, then poured herself coffee from the pot I'd made that morning. "Your mother wants you to know she's selling the bakery." I looked up from the ranch accounts I'd been reviewing. Selling it? To the Hendersons. They've wanted to buy it for years. She's donating the proceeds to whatever you decide to do with this place. I don't want her money. Maggie's eyes were steady over the rim of her mug. It's not about what you want, Kat. It's about what she needs. Let her do this. How much is she getting? $180,000. The building, the equipment, the recipes, the goodwill. Everything she spent 40 years building. The number settled between us. My mother had worked that bakery since before I was born, through 2 Wyoming recessions, and the slow death of small-town commerce. It was her identity as much as Morrison Ridge was my grandfather's. She doesn't have to do this. Yes, she does. Maggie set down her mug. You think this is about money, but it's not. It's about her trying to find a way back to being someone she can look at in the mirror. I didn't respond. Maggie let the silence stretch, then changed subjects. Daniel's lawyer called me. They're trying to negotiate a plea deal with the DA, probably looking at 18 months minimum security, restitution, probation. And Dad? The audit came back. He took $347,000 from ranch accounts between 2017 and 2024. The DA is considering charges, but given his age and health, they might settle for restitution and supervised probation. Health? He had a heart attack 3 days after the trial. Minor, but real. He's home now, but the doctors say stress and gambling did damage that can't be undone. The information should have moved me, should have triggered something. Instead, I just felt tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying anger so long. You forget what it feels like to set it down. Maggie left an hour later, taking her empty coffee mug and leaving the pies. I put them in the freezer, unsure if I'd ever eat them, but unwilling to throw away the labor they represented. That evening, my father's truck appeared in the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as he climbed out slowly, one hand pressed to his chest like he was testing whether his heart would hold. He made it to the porch, knocked twice, then stood waiting in the cold. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. Can we talk? 5 minutes. He nodded, accepting the boundary, pulled a folded envelope from his jacket pocket, and held it out. I took it. Inside were discharge papers, military documents gone yellow with age, Department of the Navy, discharge, other than honorable, reason, gambling on military installation, date, November 15th, 1977, name, Robert James Morrison. You were in the Marines for 14 months, boot camp, infantry training, then stationed at Pendleton. I started gambling almost immediately. Poker games in the barracks, betting on everything from football to how long it would take new recruits to quit. I was good at it, or thought I was. Won $3,000 my first 6 months. He paused, breath coming hard in the cold. Then I lost it all in 2 weeks. Borrowed from guys I shouldn't have. Couldn't pay them back. The command found out, gave me a choice. Court-martial or discharge. I took the discharge. Did Grandpa know? He was waiting when I got home. Didn't say a word, just took those papers and burned them in the fireplace. Told everyone I'd been medically discharged. Gave me a job at the ranch. Kept the secret his whole life. Why are you telling me this now? Because you need to understand. When Grandpa said he was leaving the ranch to you, when he said you understood responsibility and honor in ways I never did, he was right. But it wasn't just about military service. It was about this. He looked down at the discharge papers in my hands. He knew I'd failed at the one thing he'd asked me to do, serve with honor. And when you enlisted, when you actually did it right, it was like watching everything I wasn't succeed where I'd failed. So you hated me for it. I hated myself. But it was easier to aim that at you. The honesty was brutal, unadorned. I folded the papers and handed them back. Keep these. They're your burden, not mine. Kat, I'm not ready to forgive you. I don't know if I ever will be. But I can give you this. I understand now. Understanding isn't forgiveness, but it's something. He took the papers with trembling hands, tucked them back into his jacket. Thank you. He turned to leave, made it 3 steps before I spoke again. Dad, get help. Real help. Not because I'm asking, but because you owe it to whatever time you have left. He nodded without turning around, climbed into his truck, and drove away into darkness that had come early the way it does in Wyoming winters. Christmas arrived with temperatures that dropped below 0 and stayed there. I spent the holiday alone except for Duke, reading through my grandfather's journals by firelight. The entries painted a picture of a man who'd carried more weight than anyone realized. Korea, a first daughter lost to pneumonia, a wife who died of grief, a son who'd inherited weakness instead of strength. December 26th, the date I found what Maggie had hinted at but never explained directly. The entry was from June 1955, 3 years after my grandfather had returned from Korea and married Rose, his first wife whose name I'd only heard mentioned once or twice growing up. Catherine Rose left us today, 3 years and 2 months old. Pneumonia took her so fast we barely had time to understand what was happening. Rose won't speak, won't eat. The doctor says grief, but I see it in her eyes. She's choosing to follow our daughter. I can't stop her. The next entry was dated a year later. Rose died in her sleep last night. The doctor called it heart failure, but I know better. You can die of a broken heart if you want it badly enough. She wanted it. I buried her next to Catherine Rose in the cemetery east of town. No one came except Maggie. I don't blame them. What do you say to a man who's lost everything? Further down, an entry from 1979, the year I was born. Robert came by with the baby today. A girl. He named her Catherine without asking, without knowing why that name matters. When I held her, I saw my first Catherine's eyes looking back at me. Same steel, same strength. Robert doesn't see it. He sees another responsibility, another thing that might interfere with his plans. But I see the truth. This child will carry what Rose and I built. This child will understand what matters. I closed the journal, hands shaking. My name wasn't random. It was inheritance, a connection to a sister I'd never known, a grandmother who'd chosen death over a world without her daughter. My grandfather had seen that connection and protected it, building his will around the idea that some legacies transcend blood and land and become something closer to faith. The box Maggie had given me sat on the table, the one containing the photograph of my grandfather and Judge Sullivan. I opened it again, found things I'd missed the first time, a small necklace with a heart-shaped charm, a birth certificate for Catherine Rose Morrison dated April 12, 1952, a death certificate dated July 8, 1955, and underneath, a letter in my grandfather's handwriting, addressed to me but never sent. Dear Kat, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you found what I couldn't tell you while I lived. You're named for my first daughter, the child I lost before I learned how to be a father. Rose and I never recovered from that loss. We tried, but grief is a weight that crushes some people and makes others stronger. When you were born, when Robert named you Catherine without knowing the history, I took it as a sign. 2 Catherines, 2 chances to do right by that name. I failed the first one by not protecting her from sickness I couldn't prevent. I won't fail the second by letting Robert's weakness steal your future. The ranch goes to you not because you're my granddaughter, but because you understand what it represents. Honor isn't inherited, Kat. It's chosen every day in moments when no one's watching. You've chosen it every day of your life. That's why the land is yours. That's why everything I built is yours. Don't let them take it. Don't let them make you believe you're less than you are. You carry 2 names, 2 legacies, and the strength of women who loved harder than this world knew how to hold. Bill, I sat with that letter until dawn, reading it over and over, feeling the weight of connection across generations. My grandfather hadn't just left me property. He'd left me identity, purpose, the understanding that some debts transcend the people who incur them and become obligations to memory itself. The idea came fully formed, the way good ideas sometimes do. Morrison Ridge wouldn't become apartments or subdivisions, or another casualty of economic pressure. It would become what my grandfather had been. A place where people learned to rebuild after their worlds collapsed. I called Sullivan's office the next morning, asked for a meeting. He saw me that afternoon in chambers, still wearing the silver ring that matched mine. Commander Morrison, what can I do for you? I need advice on establishing a nonprofit foundation. Veteran services, specifically PTSD treatment and reintegration support. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Tell me more. I laid out the vision. Morrison Ridge transformed into a residential treatment facility for combat veterans dealing with PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and the kind of invisible wounds that drove 22 veterans a day to suicide. 12 private cabins for residents, a main lodge for therapy and communal activities, equine therapy stables, service dog training facilities, organic gardens that gave people purpose and routine. Sullivan listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from professional interest to something deeper, more personal. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then, my son, the one you rescued in Syria. He did 2 tours in Afghanistan before that. Came home with PTSD so severe he couldn't hold a job, couldn't maintain relationships. The VA tried, but the waitlists were months long and the programs weren't designed for what he needed. He attempted suicide twice before finding a private facility in Montana that saved his life. I'm sorry. Don't be. He's alive because someone built a place like what you're describing. If you're serious about this, I'll help you navigate the nonprofit structure, connect you with the right people at the VA, introduce you to donors who care about veteran services. I'm serious. Then let's build it. The next 3 months became a blur of paperwork, permits, zoning hearings, and the kind of bureaucratic navigation that would have broken someone without military training in following chains of command. Sullivan was as good as his word, opening doors and making introductions. Maggie volunteered to manage the administrative side, her organizational skills honed by 40 years of running a household and helping neighbors. My mother appeared one morning in January with a check for $180,000, the entire proceeds from selling Linda's Pie Corner. She held it out without speaking, her eyes red from crying or lack of sleep or both. I can't take this. It's not for you. It's for them. The veterans who'll come here. Consider it restitution for the son I enabled and the husband I protected instead of the daughter I should have defended. The check felt impossibly heavy. I folded it, tucked it into my pocket. This doesn't fix things between us. I know, but it's a start toward fixing who I am. She left before I could respond, her car disappearing down the drive while snow began falling again, thick and soft and relentless. The Booz Allen Hamilton acquisition closed in February. $18.5 million, wired to accounts I'd set up specifically for Morrison Ridge Veterans Haven. $3 million went immediately into an endowment fund that would generate operating revenue in perpetuity. Another $2 million covered construction costs for renovating the existing structures and building new cabins. The remaining $13 million sat in reserve, waiting for the moment when the Haven would need expansion or unexpected repairs, or simply the cushion that allowed us to say yes to veterans who needed help regardless of their ability to pay. Daniel's plea deal came through in March. 18 months at a minimum security facility in Colorado, 3 years probation, full restitution of the fraudulent mortgage plus penalties. He'd lose his law license, his career, everything he'd built, but he'd avoid a trial and the publicity that would have destroyed whatever remained of the Morrison name in Wyoming. I visited him before he reported to serve his sentence, driving to the halfway house where he was staying pending transfer. He looked smaller than I remembered, worn down by guilt and consequence, and the reality that choices have prices. I wanted to say I'm sorry again, but you told me that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't, but this does. When you get out, if you get treatment for the addiction and the depression that drove it, there might be a place for you at the Haven. Not as management, not in any position of authority, but as someone who helps other people rebuild after they've hit bottom. Why would you do that? Because everyone deserves a second chance if they're willing to do the work. Grandpa taught me that. He gave Dad a second chance after the discharge. Dad wasted it. Don't waste yours. I won't. We'll see. The construction crews worked through spring, transforming Morrison Ridge from a deteriorating ranch into something purposeful and alive. The main house became a lodge with a commercial kitchen, dining hall, and common areas designed for group therapy and community building. 12 cabins rose along the eastern pasture, each one named for a campaign where American forces had fought. Normandy, Iwo Jima, Chosin, Fallujah, Kandahar, Ramadi. By May, we'd hired staff. licensed therapists specializing in PTSD, equine therapy specialists, a full-time veterinarian for the service dog program, administrative support, maintenance workers. 23 people total, more than half of them veterans themselves, all of them committed to the mission of helping people who'd served their country find their way back to living in it. The grand opening was scheduled for June 15th, 2025, exactly 1 year after my grandfather's journal entry about being struck by his son. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. A year to go from family violence to family healing, from private shame to public service. The morning of the opening came clear and cold, the kind of Wyoming day where the sky looks close enough to touch. 150 people gathered on the lawn outside the main lodge, veterans and families and community members who'd watched Morrison Ridge transform from abandoned property to working facility. My father attended in a wheelchair, his heart too weak for standing through long ceremonies, but his presence necessary for his own healing. My mother stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, both of them smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what they'd done and who they were learning to become. Daniel sent a letter from the federal facility in Colorado. I read it the night before and decided it was between him and whatever peace he managed to find with himself. Judge Sullivan stood on the platform we'd built for speeches, wearing his Marine dress blues despite being 30 years retired. The sight of him in uniform drew murmurs from the crowd, recognition that this wasn't just another ribbon cutting, but something closer to a memorial made functional. I wore my Navy dress blues as well, the same uniform I'd worn to court, but this time it felt lighter, less like armor, and more like acknowledgement of service completed and service beginning. Sullivan spoke first, his voice carrying across the gathering. A year ago, I sat in judgment of a family torn apart by greed, addiction, and betrayal. Today, I stand in celebration of what rises from those ashes when someone chooses purpose over bitterness. Morrison Ridge Veterans Haven exists because Commander Catherine Morrison understood that the best way to honor loss is to prevent it in others. He gestured to the buildings behind him. These structures will house veterans struggling with wounds we cannot see, but that kill as surely as any bullet. The therapists here will provide evidence-based treatment. The animals will offer unconditional acceptance. The land itself will teach the lessons that only silence and space can convey. He paused, looked directly at me. But more than that, this place will offer what every veteran needs and too few receive. The understanding that they are not alone, that their struggles are not weakness, and that coming home from war is a journey that sometimes takes years to complete. He stepped back. I took his place at the microphone, looking out at faces that represented every war America had fought since Korea, every branch of service, every variation of what it meant to carry the weight of combat back into civilian life. 1 year ago, I walked into a courtroom wearing this uniform to defend my honor. My family thought I was a struggling veteran fighting for a piece of land worth $2.8 million. They didn't know about the business I'd built. They didn't know about the success I'd achieved in silence. I let that settle, saw recognition move through the crowd. But here's what they really didn't know. What I'm announcing today for the first time publicly. Morrison Security Consulting has been acquired by Booz Allen Hamilton for $18.5 million. Of that amount, $5 million is being donated immediately to establish the Morrison Ridge Veterans Haven Endowment Fund. The crowd stirred, whispers becoming conversation. Additionally, $3 million has been allocated for ongoing operating expenses, ensuring that every veteran who comes through these doors receives free housing, free therapy, free medical care, and free job training for up to 12 months. I paused, seeing my mother's tears, my father's bowed head. This facility will operate in perpetuity. It will never charge veterans for services. It will never turn away someone who needs help because they lack resources. And it will never forget that the debt we owe to those who serve isn't paid with parades and platitudes, but with concrete action when they need it most. My grandfather built Morrison Ridge with his hands. My father almost destroyed it with his pride. I'm rebuilding it with purpose, with the understanding that legacy isn't what you own, but what you give to those who come after. The applause started slowly, building like distant thunder. I looked down at the silver ring on my right hand, the one my grandfather had worn through Korea and given me when I'd earned it through my own service. They taught me land is wealth. The military taught me service is wealth, but my grandfather taught me the truth. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build into the future, brick by brick, choice by choice, until the weight of the past becomes the foundation for something better. This is his legacy, this is mine, this is ours. The applause became something else then. Recognition that we were witnessing not just a facility opening, but a family transformation made public. A private shame converted into collective healing. After the ceremony, people toured the cabins and stables, met the staff, asked questions about admission criteria and treatment protocols. I shook hands until my fingers ached, accepted congratulations and thanks, and the kind of heartfelt appreciation that comes from people who understand exactly what this place represents. My father wheeled himself over as the crowd thinned, my mother pushing the chair. He held out a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. Seattle Times, Business Section 2022. Morrison Security Consulting, named top defense contractor advisory firm. Founder Catherine Morrison, Navy commander, builds $12 million business. I found this 2 years ago, online. I was searching your name after I'd hit bottom after the casino sent those men. I've been reading about you ever since. Every article, every contract announcement, every mention of your success. He looked up at me, eyes wet. I told myself you didn't need us anymore, that you were too successful to care about your broken family. But the truth is I couldn't face what you'd become, everything I'd failed to be. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for time. Whatever I have left, I want to spend it becoming someone worthy of being called your father. My mother produced a box from beneath the wheelchair, lifted it with both hands. Inside were envelopes, dozens of them, all addressed in my handwriting. Every letter you sent us. 47 total, spanning 5 years. Your father forbade me from opening them, said you'd chosen the military over family, and we should respect that choice by ignoring you completely. She opened the top envelope, removed the letter inside, read aloud in a voice that shook. Dear Mom and Dad, I made officer today. '01 Ensign. Grandpa would be proud. I started a small consulting business on the side, helping defense companies understand military needs. It's going well. I still pay the ranch taxes every year. I always will. It's my responsibility now. I wish you could see me, not as the failure you think I am, but as who I've become. Love always, Kat. The letter was dated 2010, 14 years ago, written when I was still trying to bridge a gap that turned out to be unbridgeable. I kept them all. Even when your father threw them away, I retrieved them from the trash and hid them. I didn't have the courage to open them, but I couldn't let them be destroyed. She held out the box. These are yours. Your words, your attempts to stay connected. I'm sorry I never read them. I'm sorry I chose his anger over your love. I took the box, felt the weight of unopened communication, years of reaching out into silence. You can't change the past, Mom, but you can choose what you do with the time you have left. That's the only wealth that matters. My father spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Will you let us try? Not for forgiveness, just for the chance to become people you might someday be willing to know. I looked at them, these two broken people who'd enabled each other's worst impulses and lost almost everything in the process. Looked at the facility behind me, at the veterans who'd already begun arriving for the first residential sessions, at the staff who'd committed to this mission of healing. Try. That's all I'm offering. Try to become honest. Try to get treatment. Try to understand that trust is rebuilt in small increments, not grand gestures. We will. They left together, my mother pushing the wheelchair across grass that was finally green again after months of winter brown. I watched them go, feeling something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness, but maybe the space where forgiveness could grow if they earned it. Maggie appeared beside me, her timing perfect as always. You did good, Kat. We'll see. It's easy to make promises, harder to keep them. Your grandfather used to say the same thing, but he also said that sometimes people surprise you. Give them room to surprise you. That evening, after everyone had left, Sullivan gave me one final gift, a box from the Marine Corps archives, records from Chosin Reservoir that detailed my grandfather's actions the day he'd saved Sullivan's life. The citation had recommended him for a Silver Star, but the paperwork was lost in the chaos of retreat, and he'd never received recognition. I'd rectified that through Pentagon channels. The medal would arrive in a month, posthumous but earned. On what would have been my grandfather's 94th birthday, Sullivan and I planted a tree on the Haven grounds. A Douglas fir, slow-growing but built to last centuries. At its base, we placed a plaque, William James Morrison, 1931 to 2007, Korea, Iraq, Wyoming. He taught us that honor isn't what you say, it's what you keep when nobody's watching. Standing there in the cold, looking at the Tetons that had witnessed my grandfather's entire life, I felt the weight I'd carried for 17 years finally settle into something manageable, something almost like peace. The wind picked up, speaking in the language he'd taught me to understand. It said some debts span generations. It said legacy is built in silence and revealed in action. It said I'd done what he'd trusted me to do, kept faith with what mattered even when the cost was high. Duke pressed against my leg. Sullivan stood beside me, his hand on the tree we'd just planted. And somewhere in the distance, a veteran laughed at something someone said, the sound carrying across snow and grass, and the space where my grandfather's ranch had become a place of healing. I'd walked into court wearing a uniform to defend my honor. I'd revealed wealth that shocked a family who'd underestimated me. I'd taken what they'd tried to steal and converted it into something that would help people long after I was gone. Not revenge, not bitterness, just the simple, devastating power of choosing purpose over pain, of building something that mattered more than being right, of understanding that the truest victories are the ones that serve something bigger than the self. The wind whispered through the branches of the tree we'd planted, and for the first time in 17 years, I heard my grandfather's voice in it, clear and proud and at peace. "Well done, Kat, well done."